Hi there and welcome once again. This is Gina from McGuire. I'm back with another video that is all about using the products you have and getting new looks from them. Today is a technique that I call cut-up stamping. It's nothing fancy, but basically you're creating a stamped panel and you're cutting it up for a new look. I'm going to show you a bunch of different ways to do this, ways that I found make it really easy. Now I know it's kind of scary to cut up some of the things that you've spent a lot of time stamping, but I assure you that this is a great way to get new looks from what you have. Okay, so let's dive into my first examples, and the first few cards all involve this beautiful Altenew stamp set called Exotic Tulips. Now I'm a fan of layering stamps, which I think you might know if you've seen my videos before. This one is especially beautiful because it creates such realistic looks, and because of the shape of the flowers and the stems, they're very easy to line up. Also keep in mind that Altenew offers color suggestions and card designs and a layering guide in their packaging, so it's important to keep that. I'll be following those today. Now, in addition to having coordinating dies available for their stamp sets, Altenew now also has mask stencils available for some of their floral stamp sets. So you can see here you have the negative space and the positive space of the flowers, and I'll be using those to do some masking today, so you'll see that in a few minutes. Now, whenever I get a new stamp that I've never used, I like to really firmly rub it with a cloth, just to kind of work the surface a little bit so that the ink sticks to it better. You'll see the color of the surface changes a little bit, and that really makes a big difference in getting good results. Now I'm using my MISTI stamping tool today because I'm doing multiple stamped images, but you could definitely do this with an acrylic block if you prefer. You'll see that I'm doing a few different color options. I'll end up doing 3 different tulip cards with different color combos, and I'll share the color combos once the cards are complete. So I started with the first layer. After I stamp that in all my panels, I'm moving on to the second layer. Once again, I'm using that cloth just to prep my stamp. It's a dry cloth. Then I can add my ink and stamp the second layer. You can see already how just adding that second layer really brings these to life. And I thought since some tulips are two-tone, I would try that too, so I did a little yellow and peach colored tulip also. So I continued on and added the third layer to all of my tulips. I'm going to skip through that because I want to focus on the technique of cutting up your images here, but I just wanted to give you a basic idea of how this layering works. Now for the stems, I used Altenew Parrot ink and Altenew Shadow Creek ink. Those are 2 different green colors, and I think they layer together beautifully. So you can see how I'm adding some leaves now to the stems. All of these are included in that set, and there's a guide that makes it real easy to follow along. After I did my 3 panels, I decided I wanted to have a third leaf that was behind that center flower. So I'm going to position my stamp right over my panel here, and then we're going to have to do a bit of masking. Now normally if you want to do masking, you need to stamp on some masking paper, cut it out, and put it over your image. But remember how I showed you that this stamp set has coordinating masks available? Well, I'm just temporarily adhering those masks over these 2 floral stamped images, the ones that will overlap, and then I can do my stamping. Then I can remove the mask, and you'll see that we don't have overlap. So this doesn't take much time because I have those masks, but remember you could also cut your own if you need to. Masking is an easy way to really make your card come to life because adding those layers or levels of dimension makes a big difference. Okay, so I went ahead and I completed all the layers for all the images on all 3 panels. I wanted to add some blue sky behind my flowers. So I broke out those masks once again, and I'm just temporarily adhering them over my stamped areas. Then I'm coming in with my life-changing brushes and adding some Altenew Sea Breeze Ink. This is a beautiful sky color. You can put this color on very soft if you want, but I wanted to go for bold color on this one. You'll see me use a lighter color layer later on to show that you can do that with these brushes. But there you can see how the masks work perfect for protecting your floral images so you can add color over it or even stamp. There were a few places where I didn't line up my masks very well. I just fill those in with a matching marker, but you definitely could leave them if you wanted to. Okay, now that we've inked and stamped our 3 panels, it's time to cut them up to get different looks. So I did trim all of these panels down to 3.5 by 4 3/4. You can definitely do whatever size you want. I'm going to draw a line right down the center back. I like to draw lines on the back because no one will ever see them. It can help me to make sure I get everything centered and straight. Now don't worry too much about measuring lines. I'll show you how you can eyeball things as we go along in this video. Next, I'm going to use my trimmer to cut just a little bit to the right of that pencil line and just a little bit to the left of that pencil line. So basically what this will do is cut a little bit out of the center. So I cut a little bit to the right. Now I'm going to cut a little bit to the left. I find that this is the easiest way to cut just a sliver out of the center of your panel. Next, we want to cut a little bit of a bigger area horizontally across this so that we have room for a sentiment. So I'm holding those 2 pieces together. This time I'm just eyeballing it and cutting about 1 inch from the bottom. This time I'm cutting a bigger sliver out, about a little bit over 1/4 of an inch. That way I have room for sentiment there. So those little slivers that we cut out, we don't need to keep those. We're just going to use the larger pieces. Next, I'm using Gina Connect glue, which is a great strong liquid adhesive, and I'm gluing craft foam on the back of each of our pieces. Now you could definitely use foam tape or foam squares, but craft foam is inexpensive and it also gives even dimension. And here's the best part. When you use a liquid adhesive to position these pieces, you have some wiggle room. You can still move things around while it's wet. So you can make sure that all of the pieces are lined up nicely onto your card. So I did a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch top folding white note card. And now I'm stamping a sentiment right into that opening with VersaFine Onyx black ink. I thought that it would be nice just to have a simple sentiment in that open area. And I decided not to do any other embellishments and instead just add some shimmer pen to the tulips. They would stand out more. So this is a pretty simple technique, but you get a completely different look by adding these little cut up sections. It's something that I think is a great thing to try, especially with large images like this one or background stamps. And I have lots of examples for you today. I do find the results are more impactful if you use some sort of dimensional adhesive or tape or craft foam behind the pieces, so you get that dimensional look. Okay, here is our second tulip example. This one's really quick. I did a diagonal cut across our panel. Now sometimes I like to cut thin strips of white cardstock and stamp my sentiment on it, so I can kind of put it on my card and decide where I want to cut. Sometimes that helps me to eyeball and position things. So once I was happy, I cut a diagonal line, and then I shifted that panel so that it hangs out of the trimmer a little more than 1/4 of an inch, and I cut again. It really doesn't have to be perfect. I don't think anyone will notice if you don't have it measured just right. I will once again put white craft foam on the back of these 2 stamped pieces. I just put the liquid adhesive on it, lay the craft foam in place, trim off the excess, and then I usually put something heavy on it just for a few seconds so that it dries nice and flat. Once I have those prepared, I can go ahead and put liquid adhesive on the back and position them on a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch card. I just try to make the outside edge of the card even, and that helps me with this spacing. Now the sentiments on many of my cards today are from the Altenew Needlework Motif stamp set. You can tell I've used this one a lot in the past. The sentiments are wonderful, especially this one that I'm using quite a bit today. A MISTI stamping tool is very helpful here because I don't want to mess it up at this point, but you definitely could use a long acrylic block if that's what you have. I really like how this sentiment fits perfectly in that spot. Now I could have just cut this panel down to fit on the front of the card and then cut a white cardstock strip and stamped a sentiment on that and glued that across our stamped panel. But there's something fun and unique about having this kind of card design with the cut up stamped image. I will say you could also just cut one line across your stamped panel and separate the pieces, allowing room for a sentiment. But then the proportions are off. I find it better to cut a little section out and put your sentiment in its place. It gives a more complete look. Okay, now this is my favorite trick from today, and I hope this is helpful to you. I again have my card and my panel trimmed down a bit, and I cut a few scrap pieces of white cardstock. And I'm just positioning them where I would love them to be across my card. This sure beats measuring and making sure they're evenly spaced and all that. Instead, I am totally eyeballing it here. And where you see those white strips, that's where I'm going to cut. So what I'm doing is laying them out, kind of getting the spacing good just by eyeballing it. Once I'm happy with the spacing, there's no adhesive on the back of those strips. I'm just putting some temporary tape over it to pick all the pieces up together. Then I flip it over, and I'm going to use a pencil. The pencil is going to be to make marks on both sides of those little white strips. So you see how I'm doing a little pencil mark to the left and the right of each strips on one side, and then I'll do the same on the other side. This will tell me where to cut to get diagonal lines like I positioned with those white strips. Okay, so once I have those pencil marks done, I can remove the strips and the temporary tape, and I can reuse that tape and the strips a few more times. Now I can take my trimmer, and I'm going to cut from one side to the other, connecting those little pencil marks. So I'm just going to go through and keep cutting along those pencil marks. So each time I'm cutting out a little strip of the stamped paper, and they match up with those strips that we had positioned on the front temporarily. All of the areas I'm cutting out are small, except for the one that's a little bit bigger, so there'll be room for a stamped sentiment. So this trick that I just showed you is a great way to do this technique without having to make any measurements. Okay, so once I have cut up all those little pieces, I can go ahead and put craft foam on the back of each of them, just using the liquid adhesive as I showed you before. Then I can start to position them on the front of a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card. I will say when I have a lot of pieces like this, I like to put the top piece down, then the bottom piece, and then fill in the areas between. Remember, you don't have to glue them all down perfectly. You want to eyeball it and just try to leave equal amount of space in between each section. Now the sentiment I used on this card, and also the first card that I showed you, is from this Altenew Wonderland stamp set. This is another one that I've used in videos before, but I think the sentiments are beautiful and they're perfect for this technique, just as is the Motif stamp set that I showed you earlier. So here's the final card, and I personally love the look of these multiple diagonal lines cut out of our stamped panel. I know that you might panic a little bit cutting up a stamped panel that you spent time on, but if you're looking for a fresh new design and something that's still clean and simple, this is definitely worth trying. And by the way, if you ever get a fingerprint on a stamped panel and you want to give up on the piece, try this. Maybe you could cut that section out and put a sentiment there instead. Okay, let's do another example, this time completely different look, and I just wanted to share it with you quickly because this is a simple design that can be used with many different stamps. This new Altenew stamp set would be beautiful for subtle tone-on-tone backgrounds, or I think it's gorgeous to use with a metallic embossing powder. So I'm stamping onto a dark pool colored cardstock here with VersaMark Ink. Now instead of using a metallic embossing powder, I'm using a pearl embossing powder. Pearl embossing powder picks up whatever color is behind it and gives it a metallic look. So you have almost this dark teal color silvery look. Now I could leave it as is, but here's a trick that I like to do. Once it's cool, I repeat that process right on top of the embossing I already did. This gives more dimension to your embossing and makes it stand up even more. And since this card is very simple, I thought this would really make a big impact on the final results. So I repeated this process 3 times. I did 3 layers of that pearl embossing powder, and look at the beautiful dimension that you get. Now you get more detail if you only do 1 layer, but I love the dimension that you get with the 3. Okay, so I repeated that until I covered my panel. By the way, this panel is 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. So next I'm going to flip it over and I'll draw 2 marker lines, one down the center horizontally and one down the center vertically. You can eyeball this if you want to, but it's pretty easy to do if you have a T-ruler or you have a grid work surface like I have here. Now I'm going to do what I did on my first card. I'm going to cut a little bit to the right of my line, and then I'm going to cut again a little left of my line. This will result in a thin strip being cut out of the center of our piece. Okay, so now I'm going to hold those 2 pieces together, rotate it, and do the same thing again. I'm going to cut a little bit to the right of that line and a little bit to the left. You could instead just cut down the center vertically, cut down the center horizontally, and spread those pieces out a little bit when you glue them to your card. But by cutting those sections out, you're not messing with the proportions of your stamped images, and it really gives better results. As I've done with all of my examples, I'm gluing craft foam on the back of each of these pieces for dimension. Now before I glue these onto my card, I'm going to take a marker that's a little bit darker than my cardstock and run it right along the edge. I just thought adding that nice dark edge would make each of these squares stand out more and give it a nice finished look. You could totally skip this if you want, but I was really happy with the results when I did it. This is a trick that works great for a lot of different techniques. Thought it was perfect here. So once I've done that, I can start to arrange these, and I put them towards the top of a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch note card, using that liquid adhesive to allow me to move the pieces and wiggle them to position them just right. I then stamped a sentiment right underneath it, and we have our completed card. It's a pretty simple design. You could definitely use any stamps you want for this. You could do any kind of technique you want for this. Think of all those times you've tried a new technique and you were just experimenting. Grab those pieces of paper, those inked or watercolored pieces of paper, throw some stamping on them, cut them up, and try this design. I bet you'll be happy with the results. Okay, next I have 3 examples using the same floral image, but I changed them up a little bit just to show you the different looks that you can get. This is a new Altenew Build-A-Flower set. Now this is a stamp set and the coordinating dies that come together. Of course, there's a little booklet in there with the card examples, color suggestions, and a stamping guide. This is another one that's pretty easy to line up since the distinct shape of the images, and it is so realistic. The reason I really like layering stamp sets like this one that give realistic results is I've always wanted to be an artist and I've wanted to color or draw or paint these kind of things, but I can't, so I get to totally fake it with the stamps. So I have these 3 panels. I just use Altenew purple and green inks and stamped on white cardstock. Now I'm going to use some Gina K masking magic here. This is a nice masking paper that you can reuse many times. Since I have 3 panels, I thought this was a great option, and I cut it using the coordinating die for the same flower. I'm going to position this over one of my stamped pieces, and each of the 3 panels, I'm going to do something different over the stamping. So for this example, I'm going to stamp with my favorite ever Altenew stamp, the one that I reach for the most. This is the Pinstripe stamp. It creates beautiful pinstripe diagonal lines that are a great subtle addition to just about any card. So I'm stamping right over my mask with a light purple ink. Then I can remove the mask and you can see how my stamping is left perfectly fine and I have the stripes around it. Now for the second panel, I took the mask off the first and moved it onto this one since I can reuse it a few times. I'm using my life-changing brush to apply some of the Sea Breeze Altenew Ink, which is that same blue I used before, but this time I'm doing it very light-handed. So I end up with just this soft blue halo around our flower, and it is just gorgeous. And for the third panel, I stamped with the same pinstripe background, but I used a yellow ink this time. Okay, now we can cut each of our panels down a bit. I cut it to about 2 1/4 inches wide. I actually determined that width by the width of the sentiment so that it would fit perfectly. I then trimmed the height down to 5 inches so that you could see some of the note card above and below it. Okay, now for this one, I'm showing that you can totally eyeball this if you want to. I'm going to cut a few sections out of this. This first time I cut off the bottom and then I thought, oh, I should have cut a little bit lower. So I'm going in and cutting a little bit off. Then I'm going back to the other piece and cutting a little more off. It doesn't matter. You can always put these back together how they need to be, just leaving different mounts between the cut sections. I did make that first section wider so I could stamp a sentiment. And as you can see, these pieces that I'm doing at the top, I'm just cutting out a smaller section. If you don't feel comfortable just kind of eyeballing it like I'm doing here, you can always draw pencil lines on the back of the panel and follow those when you're cutting. But this time I just went for it. So each section is going to be a little bit a different size, and it actually turns out to work out great in the end. Now I cut this piece up quite a bit, so you can see how it was good that I used a large image so that it was clearly continuous from piece to piece. Okay, so now I'm gluing these down onto the edge of a cream colored note card that's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I do put a straight edge up against it to make sure that I keep them all straight and lined up. And I stamped my sentiment right into that bottom opening. So you can see how the image is still continuous. You can see the image clearly. You just have a fresh new look to it because we did this cut up technique. Now my favorite of these 3 cards is definitely this one. I think it's so unique. I rarely put a sentiment vertical like that, but it really works. It's like this contemporary style. So this time I started with the trimmed panel like I did before, but I'm cutting out an area for my sentiment vertically. I did it off to the side, so I didn't cut out too much of my flower or the stem. And then I stamped the sentiment into that open area, and that is on a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch white note card. It's such a clean and simple design. All I did was add shimmer to the flower. You could add gems and sequins to this if you want to, but sometimes I think less is more, especially with a beautiful image like this one and that beautiful sentiment. I plan to make a set of cards like this one, just changing up the colors to give as a teacher gift. Now here's the third one. I just drew pencil lines on the back just to kind of eyeball where to cut. And then I cut 3 larger sections out so that I had room for 3 sentiments. I thought that would be a unique change. And I did it all in the stem, so I didn't cover up any of the floral on the top. This is a great way to add something interesting to any tall image you have like this one. So these 3 cards show you that you can really get different looks out of the same panel depending on how you cut them up. Okay, now my next example is completely different. This is a good idea for when you want to just experiment and cover up a mistake. For this one, I'm using the Altenew Beautiful Peony stamp set. This has some gorgeous outline images. I decided to white heat emboss these on watercolor paper. That way I could play with the new Altenew watercolor brush markers. These are super fun. They have the watercolor in the pen. So all you have to do is open them and go. You can color right onto your paper. Then I also put a little puddle of water on my work surface over to the right that I could pick up with the tip of my brush marker if I want the color to be lighter. If I want the color to be darker, I just give a little squeeze to the barrel of the pen. So I can quickly add beautiful color to these images. It's hard to see all the images on there, but I did cover the entire panel with white heat embossed images. Okay, so I continued to color this all, covered it completely, and I even did blue vivid color in the background. But you'll see that spot there where the purple ran into the blue because I was too impatient to let it dry. Well, I want to cover that up, so I'm going to cut a section out there. First, I'm just going to do one cut. And I want to show you how if you just do one cut and then glue these onto your card separated a bit, see how the proportions are messed up with the flowers? They aren't continuous. It just kind of isn't pleasing to the eye. But when we go back and cut out a little strip or a section, then line them up how they're supposed to be, it's much more pleasing to the eye because the images are then continuous. This is really important if you do maybe this with a background image where there is a distinct pattern. Okay, so I put craft foam on the back of those pieces, added them onto a 4 1/4 by 4 1/4 inch note card, and I stamped a sentiment in the open area. That way I kind of hid my little mistake that I made. Nobody will ever know. And I was able to play with a new product. So as I mentioned, this technique is great if you just want to experiment or if you want to hide a mistake. Okay, my next example here has lots of stamp layering and a bit of masking. And I have a trick that I wish I would have figured out at the beginning of the video, but now I'll share it with you. Okay, this is the new Frilled Petals stamp set. So there are the layering images and the outline. So you can use them together or separate, which is always a great option to have. And keep in mind there are coordinating dies and there are coordinating mask stencils available for this set. Okay, now I'm going to skip through the stamping of this panel. It's very basic. I did do a bit of masking using the coordinating mask stencil as you see here. But I ended up doing 3 flowers, one in pinks, one in oranges, and one in yellows. Now I just did the layering images themselves at first because I wanted to show you what that looked like before I stamped the outline. So let's skip ahead here. I have all of my layering stamping done. So I can leave it like this. I think it's got such a beautiful, realistic look. But I decided to make this bold by stamping the outline image over it. So remember how this set had the layering images and the outline images. You can use them together or separate. Okay, so now we're going to stamp this one with black ink and look at how that just gives a beautiful finished look. Okay, so I finished up that stamping and now I have a trick for you. I should have thought of this earlier. This time I'm going to glue the craft foam on the back of our stamped panel first, before we cut it up. So I put some liquid adhesive on here. I'm going to rub it around really well so that we have good adhesion onto our craft foam. I'll add that craft foam piece on the back of it. I usually make the craft foam piece to be slightly smaller than our panel. After giving it a few minutes to dry, I can now cut my section out of this for the sentiment, and the craft foam is already in place. My trimmer was able to cut through it no problem. Most trimmers should be able to. Craft foam is very easy to cut. And now I have my 2 pieces ready to go, and that saved me a lot of time. I glued these onto a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch pink note card, and I actually stamped the pinstripes with pink ink on it first. Now I feel like on this design it's got so much going on. There's a lot of bold color. But since we cut a section out for the sentiment, it allows that sentiment to stand out more. So that's another case when this design is very helpful. Okay, I have one more example for you. Now in this one we did some cut up of our stamping, but I didn't add a sentiment into those cut areas. Instead I added a word die cut on top. This card features the new Altenew Dotted Blooms stamp set. It's got a beautiful image on here, and the sentiments are lovely. In fact, one of the sentiments I used on the watercolor example I did earlier. So I have a pink cardstock panel here, and I'm stamping my image with black ink. And then I'm going to rotate my paper 180 degrees, so I'm just going to rotate it around, and I'm going to stamp it again. This is a great way to fill up more space on your card with an image and save time when you're using a stamping tool. Okay, so now there are a couple layering images, or 3 layering images to go with this. And I'm stamping those with a slightly darker pink ink. And then I'll rotate it and stamp them again. It's very easy to line up, very easy to use. Now this time, since I started with a pink cardstock, I'm going and adding some white into my flowers here. I'm using the Luminance white pencil. This is an incredible white pencil that colors very bright white even on darker colored cardstocks. These pencils are quite expensive, but you can buy the white individually if you want to, and I highly recommend it. After I added the white, I noticed I had covered up some of my black lines with that pencil. So all I'm doing is stamping it again right on top. So that adds that vivid black back in place. And in fact, I decided to go ahead and clear heat emboss this too. I'm using VersaFine Onyx black ink, which is a quick drying pigment ink, but it's perfect if you want to do some clear embossing on top. So after I've stamped this, made sure I had good coverage, I'll add my clear embossing powder and heat set. And then we have the beautiful results of those light pink and white flowers against a light pink background. Next, I'm stamping that same pinstripe background with light pink ink right on top. What's cool is the white pencil almost resists that ink that we put on top, then kind of sits on top of it so I can dab it away and you won't see the stripes on our flowers, which is super cool. Now I'm rotating at 90 degrees and stamping again, and this will give us like a crosshatch pattern. It's always fun when you can get more than one look from a stamp, and this one definitely offers that. So I wanted to cut this one up so it kind of looked like a window pane. So I'm flipping it over and using my T-ruler, and I'm going to do 3 lines vertically and 3 lines horizontally. You could totally measure this if you want to, but honestly, I'm just kind of eyeballing it. Whatever works best for you. Everybody's a little bit different, but you can measure them if you want to. But it is handy to have a T-ruler to make sure that your lines are straight when you do make them. Okay, now it's time to cut those sections out. So I cut a little bit to the right of the line and a little bit to the left, and that allows me to take thin little sections out. Now hold those pieces together and do the same vertically. If these pieces kind of move as you're doing this, you could always temporarily tape them together, but I find it's pretty easy just to kind of hold them in place as I do the cutting. Okay, so I went ahead and added white craft foam to the back of each of those pieces. I should have put the craft foam on first like I did on the last card, but again, I forgot. And then I arranged those onto a white note card. You can see that we cut little sections out so our stamped images have a very continuous look. You can also see that fun crosshatch pattern that we got from the pinstripe background. I added some pearls and then a layered white die cut sentiment. You could do a stamped sentiment here, but I felt like this kind of filled in that little space nicely. All right, so there you have lots of examples of getting new looks from your stamping by cutting up your images. I know it's scary to do at first, but it's definitely worth a try. I hope you'll give it a try. If you're interested in these supplies, I always have them linked in my YouTube description below. In the middle are a couple other videos that you might be interested in. I thank you for sticking around for this long episode. I hope you have a great day and we'll be back soon.